Good evening. My name is Helen Young, and I am the director of The Chinese Lady and your moderator tonight. I'm very happy to be back here at Timeline, as I've worked on a few things in the past and excited that they have called me back, and I'm happy to be with you here tonight. We'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. We recognize that Timeline Theater sits on the native land of the people of the Council of Three Fires, including the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa. Although for over 200 years, Native nations have been forcibly removed from this territory, we must acknowledge that this land continues to be a site of gathering and healing for more than a dozen other tribal nations and remains home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. Additionally, settler colonialism is embedded in the technologies, structures, and ways of thinking we use every day. We are using equipment and high-speed internet not available in many Indigenous communities. Even the technologies central to making theater leave significant carbon footprints, changing climates, disproportionately affecting the Indigenous peoples worldwide. As we gather, we contribute our work and art as a form of collaboration in the healing of the land. Last year, when Timeline asked me to direct a play about the first Chinese immigrant woman to come to America, I started thinking, wow, what a fun, amazing challenge. And having read Lloyd Suh's play, The Chinese Lady, I knew he was playing with some things in space and time, which I was very intrigued by. I started to wonder, and I went through the Rolodex in my head of all the pictures that I had, having watched various Chinese movies, television, read newspaper articles, of pictures in my mind of what a Chinese woman in the 1800s may think, dress, behave, engage with the world around her. And I started to wonder, what would that look like for her to do that in America? And I was very intrigued by that, because I think in American culture, we don't necessarily look at that overlay between the past and the present and see what that means. Instead, we're very future oriented. We're always thinking about the future. We're thinking about how to travel in space. We're thinking about, in previous centuries, first man on the moon. We're thinking about how to save money for retirement. So it's always about the future. So I was very intrigued by that, and how to be able to share that through the story of the Chinese lady. And the other thing that came to mind was, how did that exchange happen in 1834 between her and her presentation to her audience? And I think that if we inspect that exchange, we might be able to understand what roots were created. And from understanding those roots, we may be able to sort out some of what's happening today in the conversation between Asians and whites in America. And if we can sort out some of those things, then maybe we as a community together of storytellers with empathy can try to influence and affect change, and hopefully change the future for the better. So there's the future, but then we're going from the past to the present to the future, which is very much Timeline. So I'm very excited to have that be something that we do through The Chinese Lady, which is also very much part of my heritage. I'm also from Canton, China. So Afong Moy, who's from Canton, China, and I have similar roots in that respect. Now, our full production of the play was originally scheduled to open tonight, but of course we had a small, presumably once in a century interruption. But we're thrilled to still bring you a sample of that play, and we still hope to produce The Chinese Lady next year if everything goes well. I'm thrilled to announce that we have a terrific lineup for you tonight, including an introduction to the play from our playwright, Lloyd Suh, followed by a few sections of scenes from the play featuring Stephanie Hsu as Afong Moy and Rammel Chan as Atung. We'll also be joined by dramaturg Yiwen Wu, who will share a little bit about the life of Afong Moy and the world she entered in 1834. Finally, we will end tonight with a panel discussion, including the playwright Lloyd Suh, comparative race scholar from Princeton University, Anne Anlin Cheng, and Christine Mock from the University of Rhode Island, whose research focuses on race and representation. And now I'd like to introduce you to our playwright, Lloyd Suh. Welcome, Lloyd. Hello.
Thank you, Helen. Hello. Thanks so much for having me here. It's really great to see you and to have this chance to connect with your team and with everyone at Timeline. I really appreciate this opportunity to be in conversation around this play, even though It's obviously not possible to share space together, but just in anticipation of all the next steps to come. And I'm especially excited about, Timeline's mission of examining history for insight into the present and in the future is a big part of what's most important about this play to me in particular. It was written at a very different time than the time we're in right now. It was written only just a few years ago, but it feels like so much has changed in the world already in that time. And the piece exists with, it's part of a thing that I've been doing a lot in the past 5 years, which is writing about history, which is writing about Asian American history in particular, and try to get a sense of these forgotten moments in Asian American history, and trying to understand why they're forgotten, trying to understand what they mean about where we are now, how they've led to where we are now, and how they might help us find a way forward. And I think that, where we are in the world now is kind of confusing. There are times when I feel very optimistic about it, and there are times when I feel very, very pessimistic about it. And the act of writing a play in a big way is the act of wanting to spend time with other people working that stuff out, to really getting in a room and trying to understand something together. And so any opportunity like this is very meaningful for me to be able to share space with you and all these very smart people that I know we're going to be in conversation with later, to try to come to some sort of understanding, and with the goal, maybe even a sense of hope. And so thanks for having me.
Wow, what a really wonderful performance by Stephanie and Rammel. Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Yiwen, the dramaturg of The Chinese Lady. I am so pleased to be here to share some of the history behind this play with you. First, I want to invite you to take a closer look at this print with me. It is an 1835 lithographic print featuring Afong in a salon in New York City. Behind where she sits, we see paintings of Chinese men and women, a Chinese lantern, and next to her, a Chinese teapot and cups. Yes, she's here to help sell Chinese goods, but look how her hands tightly clasp around her stomach. If we look at her really closely into her eyes, you see, she also looks back at us. Who was Afong in history? In 1834, two American merchants, Frederick and Nathaniel Carn, brought Afong from her hometown Guangzhou to New York City and exhibited her as, quote-unquote, the Chinese lady, to attract customers to purchase their Chinese curiosities. On October 17, 1834, when the Carn stocking trade cargo sailed into New York Harbor with a ship full of tea and fancy Chinese goods, a special passenger received special mention in the New York Daily Advertiser. Quote, "The ship Washington, Captain Aubert, has brought out a beautiful Chinese lady called Julia Fuchi Chingchang King, daughter of Hong Wang Tangxi King. As she will see all who are disposed to pay 25 cents, she'll no doubt have many admirers." Quote. A lengthy name here in the ads combines a series of appellations that sounded Oriental, along with an English forename Julia, as well as an honorific title King. On the next day, however, on the manifest records of the ship Washington, a royal and oriental lady was suddenly renamed as Afong, the only name spelled in lowercase in the list of passengers. Afong reads like a series of letters randomly strained together, just like a noise. Afong was listed as a servant of Captain Aubert's wife. Then, 2 weeks later, on November 6th, our Chinese lady adopted a simpler new name, Afong. Well, with this English spelling, it is impossible to reconstruct this name in Chinese characters. But given its sound, Afong was likely only a generic Chinese name. The character for Moi was likely not a family name, but a diminutive suffix that means little girl or sister, whereas the use of ah as the first syllable indicates that the name is an informal address. Yes, we could call her Afong Moi, as she was mostly known by this name in her life in the States. But we must remember that, until today, the real name and the real life of Afong Moi is forever lost in history. Who was Afong Moi? What family was she from? What was her real name? All of these questions surrounding her identities were left unanswered. Rather, her life story was pinned down to imagined and generalized Chineseness, a foreign other, the Chinese lady. As we look for traces of her by flipping through these prints and newspapers from 19th century America, we realize that Afong Moi is someone who only lived in the other's gaze. We have no access to her own writings or anything in her own words. Rather, we can only read her through poems written after seeing her, imagine her through these drawings of her in the ads. We can only piece together a shadow image of Afong Moi through historical records that are mediated by a third party who tell her stories for her. But now, our play, The Chinese Lady, seeks to break her 200-year-long silence and imagine her with a voice of her own. Here, Lloyd brilliantly imagines her as a lively and witty spirit, affording us a chance to look at her as a real person with thoughts, ideas, humor, and emotions. If Afong Moi was already elusive and hard to trace in history, Afong Moi's male translator and personal assistant Atung was almost invisible. In Orientalism, Edward Said argues that as a result of the European colonial expansion in the 19th century, in gender terms, the West became metaphorically masculine, while the East became sexualized as a passive female. Atung was never given a pictorial representation in the ads or the catalogs. He also received only a few accounts of his activities on the stage. In 1836, only about 2 years after Afong Moi's arrival in the States, Atung's name was dropped from all the announcements. There's also no ship manifest of Atung's arrival in New York City, and no record of Atung's life after his departure from the show. It is unclear how Atung and Afong Moi were persuaded to take a part in Carnes Brothers' display of quote-unquote Chinese curiosities. Some scholars believe that Afong Moi must have been taken unwittingly. Others speculated that the two were promised an opportunity to travel around the wealthy and mysterious United States. In our play, Afong Moi exhibits a passion for cultural exchange, which helps explain her reasons behind traveling across the Pacific and coming to the States. During the late 18th and early 19th century in China, the foreign trade, albeit limited to only one port located in Canton, Guangzhou, which was Afong Moi's hometown, brought about lots of fascinating cultural exchange. To name a few exciting transcultural fusions from that time, there were export Chinese teapots adorned with American eagles, local paintings that adopted a Western perspectival method, and European glass mirrors put into traditional wooden frames. These transcultural objects occupy multiple time and space, telling us how the culture was evolving. Merchants who had been living and trading in Canton, the Carnes brothers, would have no doubt witnessed the cultural exchange happening there. Even so, they continued to brand their products as quote-unquote authentic Chinese curiosities, enforcing an imaginary national boundary between a pre-modern, backwards China and the modern United States. If as early as 19th century the world was already implicitly connected, and the word Chinese was in fact a discourse that constructed a false dichotomy, what about today? In the 21st century, where the globe becomes unprecedentedly more connected than ever, are we still using the word Chinese to just box things up and label it as foreign? Next up, we're about to see how Lloyd imagines Afong Moi around the time of the gold rush. where more and more Chinese immigrants were coming to the States.
Thank you, Rammel and Stephanie, for the beautiful performances we just watched. It was really fun to watch Afong go from 14 to 29 and beyond with Atung alongside. So for more, join us next year. I'd like to welcome our panelists tonight. First up, we have the playwright of The Chinese Lady, Lloyd Suh. Lloyd is the recipient of the 2019 Alpert Awards in the Arts and Theater and is the director of artistic programs at the Lark. Welcome, Lloyd. Hi. Do you want to share a little bit about yourself with us? I know I did a little bit, but didn't know if you want to say some more.
No, not really. I mean, I'm not the director of artistic programs at the Lark anymore. But oh no, that's totally cool. But I am like I define myself like really just as a playwright, and I think that's enough for now. Yeah. But thank you so much for having me here. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And then next we have Anne Anlin Cheng, professor of English at Princeton University. She's a writer of 3 books, The Melancholy of Race, Second Skin, Josephine Baker and the Modern Surface, and Ornamentalism. Hi, Anne. Welcome.
Hi, Helen. Hi, Lloyd. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good to see you.
Thank you.
And next is Christine Mock, assistant professor of English at the University of Rhode Island. She's also a designer, dramaturg, and founding member of Wing Space Theatrical Design. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. And last but not least, surprise, we also have Stephanie Hsu, who played Afong tonight in our reading. Stephanie is known for her time on Broadway in SpongeBob and Be More Chill. These days, you can catch her as May in The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, and you will see her coming up again in season 4. Welcome, Stephanie.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you. Great to see everybody. And just for our audience, so you all know, if you have a question that you want to ask any of our panelists, feel free to put that into the chat. And if there's a specific person you want to direct it to, you can add that to the chat as well. And we'll make sure to pick up the questions along the way. So thank you for that. I think my first question will be to Lloyd. Lloyd, Afong says in the play, what is happening is a performance. My entire life is a performance. I'm very interested in your thoughts on that. Can you share some of what were behind those words when you put them together for the play?
Oh yeah, so much. I'll try not to make this too long of an answer but I have a lot to say on this. Like I will say that like one of the things that initially just grabbed me about the idea of Afong, even before I knew that it grabbed me, like I came across her name in a book, and it just leapt out at me, this notion. And I don't know why it resonated so strongly with me, but it just stuck, and it made me go on this deeper dive into why is this sticking with me? And it occurs to me that it became instantly clear that one of the reasons is just like, a lot of my peers are in the performing arts. A lot of us are constantly representing ourselves in one way or another. And just this idea of like thinking about how the way we're perceived differs from what we actually are, and yet how much of what we do is a reaction to that, either like trying to like because of what we anticipate people might expect us to be, either leaning into that, exploiting it, or working against it or fighting it. But then even just to think that over the accumulation of a life, how much of that becomes your actual personality? How much of your actual personhood do you lose in pursuit of that performance? And so that initially attracted me as something that I could just, like on a visceral emotional level relate to. But as I got deeper into the study of her and her life, I also, I hit a point in the writing of the play where I didn't know what to do. Like I was like, okay, she's lost to history. I don't know what scene 4 is. I don't know what scene 5 is. I don't know what that is. I don't know if I can write. I don't know if this is a play I can write. So I put it away for a little while. And I didn't put it away for that long because like once I did put it away, I started to feel the absence of, you know, the pain of not being able to finish that, of knowing that what I was doing was I'm trying to excavate her in a way because she's unknowable. And then it became about this idea of using the practice that I do, which is, you know, the practice of playwriting, the practice of bringing in a text to get into a room with people to work on and to talk about together, is an act of trying to conjure her, trying to think like, what could it have been, but also knowing the ways in which we cannot know, you know, because she's lost to history, but also knowing why she was lost to history, because at a certain point, nobody cared anymore, and feeling the weight of that, feeling the weight and the pain of knowing that at a certain point, nobody cared anymore. And so taking very seriously the fact that I can care, and I can gather other people who care, and we can try to conjure her. But in that conjuring, knowing all we can do, and maybe even the best way to conjure her and to honor her, because she's an actor, right? The best way to conjure her is through a performance.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, my next question, I'd like to take what you just said, Lloyd, and pass that on to Stephanie. I'm curious what Lloyd just said about conjuring, representation, and what was the real person, honoring. What are your thoughts on that as you approach your roles, and also as you approach the Chinese lady in preparation for the reading?
Yeah, well, just I actually want to speak to something that Lloyd was talking about in the ways Afong Moy was forgotten, and just this, anytime you are an only, or anytime you are the first of anything, there's also equal stakes that you may be like a fad or forgotten. And I just want to speak to how, because I think tonight is also a conceptual conversation about what's practically happening in our world right now. You know, there is such, the fact that we're even here together talking about Asian Americans or Asians and Asians in the arts and the history that came before us is relatively new in its accessibility to the public eye. And I just want to speak to how, like, ever since Crazy Rich Asians and even what's been happening the last few years, I feel just as excited as I feel mildly anxious that this momentum is going to become a fad as opposed to a conjuring or this unearthing of all these stories that are waiting in the wings to be heard. So I just want to, I needed.
Yeah, thank you.
But yeah, then in terms of, you know, preparing for roles, or especially when they're historic, I do feel like, just to celebrate great writing and great writers and specific writers, I feel that sometimes, you know, there's obviously, this was a short rehearsal process, but memories of people also take on new voices when they come back to life. And I feel like there's this beautiful thing that happens in storytelling. That's why this isn't the documentary film of Afong Moy, it's a play, right? And there's this beautiful kind of magical realism that happens of, we know this person existed, but nobody was there Instagramming her every moment or like TikToking her. So there's going to be a lot that's left to the imagination. And that's the joy of art and inspiration, of some historical figure caught Lloyd's eye and something about her was also trying to be conjured, and like a story was trying to come through, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's just the beauty of inspiration, or people who like catch us, or ideas that stick. It's the same.
Yeah.
It's the same with roles or characters. Is sometimes you read a page and you're like, oh my gosh, that wants to come through me, or I can take that on a ride somehow.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's pretty interesting, Lloyd, that also in the play, there is like a merging of the actor, and you put it into the text, the merging of the actor and the historical and the present moment and the historical moment. The audience is both at the same time, and that kind of exchange and dialogue is very fascinating. Back to your point about fad, I'd like to ask Anne if you could comment on this idea of representation and fad, because in your book, Ornamentalism, you do discuss that to some extent. I think in the section on Anna May Wong and just kind of how she was represented. I know that's not exactly the same, but could you talk a little bit about your study on that?
Yeah, thank you so much. But first I want to say to Stephanie, what a wonderful occasion was to see you do the reading. It was a terrific reading. And I'm a big fan of yours and your character from Mrs. Maisel. So it's a great honor to share space with you. And of course, to thank Lloyd for this really incredible play, because Afong was also a figure who, when I first found out about her, stuck in my imagination, and I wrote about her in my latest book, and actually mentioned her as well in my second book. And I think it's partially because she's such a primal scene of the representation of Asiatic femininity in America, right? And I'll say more about that in a minute. But I also want to say, just as an outer, it's a larger context, that I think this question of erasure is particularly fraught for us today. You know, that the erasure of Afong Moy as someone who is lost to history, and as you noted, that even as Helen pointed out, and others, that we're not even sure if that's her name, right? And so her erasure, it just really is symptomatic of a larger erasure of Asians and Asian Americans in American history. I think about the thousands of men who worked, and many of them died, for the sake of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, which is the backbone of American modern capitalism infrastructure. And how those men are gone. There's no traces of them. We don't know their names. We don't even have very much. There's some letters that historians have found, but the disappearance of Asian Americans and Asians in America for the last 300 years is something that we can really feel today, right? I think what's going on today with all the anti-Asian sentiment and the horrendous escalation of that tells us a lot, not just about racism, but also about xenophobia, about the ways in which Asians have been seen as, strangers, perpetual foreigners. And one of the reasons, there's actually legal, historical reasons for that, but one of the, other reasons why this xenophobia is so rampant is because Asians have disappeared from the archives of American archives. And so I think a project like this is so, critically important, not to assert that we know the real Afong Moy, but to sort of say that that she lives for us as representation, and that this play is an investigation of the nature of representation itself. And so I think it's really a fascinating piece of work for that. But the fad, I think, one way to think about the fad is to think about stereotypes, right? And I think that the fact that there is such if you think about the figure of the Asian woman in America, we really should be astounded by how incredibly consistent, unchanging this, stereotype is from the 1800s all the way to the 21st century. The idea of the Asian woman as quiet, decorative, object of display, the way in which Afong Moy was displayed, just like all the other objects in that room, that she's commodified, just like the teapot, just like the chintz from China, just like the silk, just like the tea. But that stereotyping of that figure, if you think about it, it has remained remarkably stable from the 1800s to this day, right? And I was going to suggest, when we're watching the snippets of the play, I was thinking about how, we might say to ourselves, oh, what a quaint idea. This is what, 18th century exoticism looks like. We put a Chinese woman in a tableau vivant and tour her around this, the country and show her off as this object. How quaint and dated is that? And I want to suggest it's not that quaint, and it's not that dated. And we might even think about what happened. By the way, the Peel Museum, where she was shown, is what will eventually become the Museum of Natural History in New York. And in 2017, which is just a few years ago, the Metropolitan had a show called China Through the Looking Glass, which I'm sure many of you remember. That show was basically the Chinese lady, right? It's basically a sort of elaborate neoliberal heavy global capitalist extravaganza of Asiatic femininity on display, with all these extravagance. And it really is just like the Chinese lady, except in some ways it's even harder to process, because it made it very clear that you don't even need a real Chinese woman to have the exotic Chinese femininity and all its sensorial pleasure for display and for consumption. And so I just want to point out that I think, you're right. It is, that slippage from presence to representation to fad to stereotype is extremely quick. And I just want to make the observation that, we're actually still seeing versions of the show of the Chinese lady in contemporary America.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I'm intrigued by that question, the showing and then also the invisibility. Does anybody have a comment about how the two relate? That there's this showing and taking around in a show, but then we're also Asian women often seen as invisible. And, sharing from my own experience, and I mentioned this a lot to some of my friends, I'll be in line for ordering some food and somebody will just go to the person behind me and they don't see me. It's bizarre. And I think it could end up giving somebody a complex. Anyways, that's me. Let's go back to the play and the situation here. Does anybody have a comment on that, the relationship between?
Well, I mean, I do think that it's one of the tragic ambivalence of Asiatic femininity, right? That it is on the one hand seen as nothing but visuality, but the visible, right? She's associated with decoration, with aesthetic ornamentality. She is pretty silk. She is, porcelain skin. All these sort of the ways in which it's conflated with objects. But what's ironic is that particular kind of objectness and hypervisibility as object has also meant that she is invisible as subject, right, as a person. And so I do think that that paradox of being incredibly visible and yet invisible is in some ways, to me, the very definition of what Asiatic femininity means in America.
Wow. Okay. Very, very interesting about the two relationships. Christine, I know that you are also a designer, dramaturg, and I think maybe director. Am I wrong? I think you've also directed quite a bit of plays. So when you approach a project and you are making choices about how to represent Asian or Asian cultures or Asian things or thoughts, how do you approach that as an Asian designer, director, dramaturg? What are the challenges and what are some things that you think about?
So I do think that I'm threading a line through what Anne brings up, which is, I think she talks about it in terms of Asiatic femininity, but it is in a way sort of at the heart of Asian racialization in the US, which is this hypervisibility and erasure. That like one of the ways we can think about this is that with Chinese exclusion, we have this moment in which, for the first time, this is like the first immigration law, in which people are barred based upon their ethnicity, their race, right? And yet that moment in which you're barring Chinese people, what you have simultaneous to that in literature, popular culture, cultural production, a proliferation of representations of the Chinese. And so it's always, whenever I'm approaching a project, thinking about how to thread that needle between all of these proliferations of representations and the work that, so I tend to work with a lot of Asian American playwrights and with actors of Asian descent, right? How to then sort of move through all of that stuff. So Anne, in her book, one of the things that I really love about her book Ornamentalism is actually the way in which she describes the yellow woman as encrusted, that we can think of all of these stereotypes and all of these representations have sort of been encrusted upon actual Asian bodies, and that the work that often has to happen is how do you slough off that encrustment? How do you begin to move when all of that encrustment and all of that history is there? And I want to sort of loop back to part of our earlier conversation. I too was so thrilled to see the performance that Stephanie gave to us. Thank you so much. But there's a way in which performance has for a really, really long time existed as a kind of anti-archive, that it's been structured as the opposite of the archive. If the archive is the place in which you have this repository of documents, that performance is part of this sort of lived genealogy, a repertoire. But I think one of the ways that we can think about what happens, because this is actually how Susan Laurie Parks thinks about her own playwriting, is that what she does is she goes and digs up the bones, listens to the bones, sings, and then writes it down. She thinks about the work that she does as a playwright is that. Because I think there's something in particular about performance that enables a kind of historical knowledge that gets generated through difference and repetition. So that when we're conjuring Afong Moy, yes, there's all these things that we no longer have access to, but there's also something that remains. And I think that's the thing that gets animated. And I also think that's the thing that, so Anne mentioned that, the first time she ever read about Afong Moy, I too feel that. And I think that most, actually all scholars of Asian American literature, history, Asian American studies, there's something really about Afong Moy that remains, that keeps us up at night, keeps us wondering, and that there's a way in which this play is this incredible kind of love letter to that, and a kind of intervention into American history. And I think about that intervention into American history. There's a way in which the play invites. So one of Anne's colleagues at Princeton is this woman, Jill Dolan, and she has this incredible book, which is called The Feminist Spectator as Critic. And there's a way in which Lloyd's play invites any spectator to become a kind of Asian Americanist, to engage in Asian Americanist critique. Because once you begin to sort of pay attention to Asian America, once you pay attention to Asian racialization, all kinds of histories and archives get opened up. A way of seeing the world gets opened up. A way of understanding history opens up. And I think that that's the thing that gets invoked throughout this play.
Wow, thank you. Thank you.
Can I jump in on, Christine, yeah, this is, how do I frame this? Because I think there's something so interesting to me about this, because I know, this idea of performance as anti-archive, but also just this question about performance text and how that lives. How a text written for a present tense can exist in the future, but also thinking about as the future as archive, but also as present tense. But I'm also thinking about, because you talked about I know you're writing a book about failure, right? And I don't necessarily know what that means or how you're framing failure, but I'm so interested in this from the performance point of view, because success is very hard. And so the idea of failure is also something about striving for something that's a little out of reach. And I think of when I think of Afong Moy with respect to failure, I think about the ways in which like how failure and success are kind of like are like, I don't know, like like you know, like as performing artists, you know, like there are the things that the industry defines, this is what success looks like, right? And like I've never, like, it's hard to think of success and failure in the same terms as the rest of the world does. Like, I just can't see those things as like how I determine failure and success, because it feels racialized, you know. Somehow.
Well, how's the thing? Failure and success means something really particular if we're going to talk about Asian Americans, right? If we're going to talk about model minoritarianhood, if we're going to think about that kind of like articulation of success. But I think failure, when we think about theater, like the entire sort of theatrical endeavor, right? This constant, this thing that we do that we repeat over and over and over again, right? And I think that is like, that you build that in, like, into the play. Like, if this is as much a play about performance or rehearsal. It's like, is it a rehearsal play? Is it a performance play? Like, where does it sort of reside in this? Because we actually see Afong Moy, the character, have to do that thing that we all do, which is like, as if for the first time, welcome. I've never done this again. And yet also to sort of feel the very weight of what all of those repetitions are doing. But the thing is, with every repetition, there is the promise for difference, for something else to happen within the space of that repetition, for something different to occur. And maybe for that different thing to, I don't know, get us towards the anti-racist future that we want, right? Is that the thing that is being there, that perhaps like draws all of us to theater? But I think that there's a way in which, you know, particularly in connection to your play, Charles Francis Chan Jr.'s, God, I'm going to mess it up. Oriental Murder Mystery? Is that the order?
I don't remember.
Oh. which is like, which is the play about Frank Chin, which is also the play about the founding of Asian American theater, right? Because there's something in terms of the Asian American movement that is like, oh my goodness, there is something here in theater. There is something here in this live thing that we do in front of people, with people, that moves people, right? That needs to be like part of the Asian American movement. That needs to be part of, you know, this possibility to imagine a kind of third world, a possibility of imagining liberation. And I think that there's a way in which, you know, we all have that very optimism, which is you sit there in front, you know, like you sit there in the dark, and that moment before a curtain separates, in which you're like, oh, this could be revelatory, right? And in some ways it always is, because for however long that is, that hour and 45 minutes, that 5 hours, that like 12 hours if you love marathon theater, you are changed along with everybody else around you, right?
This is so juicy. I wish we could talk for so many hours. I love speaking with people who are specifically scholars, because it feels like a real, as opposed to, I feel like, you know, it feels like there's a lot of heavy research. But I wanted to just quickly speak to Erasure. And I've been thinking a lot over the past years about, you know, this whole stereotype of the model minority, or, you know, demure Asian people who are like very silent and quiet,
The butterfly.
The little butterfly, the blah, blah, blah. And I've just been thinking about how, in terms of the first wave of immigrants, so much of what was going on was also a language barrier, right? Is that there was actually just erasure was happening because many people, English was not their first language. And so perhaps a survival tactic was like, just do the thing, check the boxes, do good at your work, and no one's going to hurt you, right? Like, our ancestors' way, or people who came to America's way of coping was like, you know, like, hang your head low, but do what you can and you'll be safe, right? Because during the Transcontinental Railroad, people were really violent, and there were a lot of people who were physically harmed. And this is something that I'm sure everyone in this room, like, that's a narrative that somewhere in the back of our heads, everything that's happening right now, I don't know, I'll speak for myself, is not a surprise. It is really painful, but I'm not surprised. And I'm sad that I'm not surprised, because I think I spent most of my life trying to assimilate against that narrative that I am other. And what we're seeing in this moment is so many threads that tie to the history, all the way back to the Chinese Exclusion Act, all the way back to every single story we've ever heard from our grandparents or anyone who's been like, you're not really an American, you know? So there's that. But then also in terms of what that means, being an Asian person in the arts with success and failure, it means that I think that like any moment where you get in through the door is such a success, but it's not like, oh my God, you congratulations, you did the thing. There is such weight and torch bearing that comes with that, which means that any successive failure, which failure is inevitable, you're always going to fall and get back up, but the failure suddenly feels heavier than just like, oh, I wrote a play and it was bad, or like, oh, I booked a job, but like my role wasn't that great on it, or I didn't do a good job. It becomes like, oh my God, I have failed my people. You know what I mean? Like if they think I'm bad, they might not. They think we're all bad, you know? And even though I would probably never describe it like that, I can really feel as the years go by that is the responsibility that is both beautifully inspiring and empowering, and also incredibly heavy, because it makes it so that, you know, every story has to be a breakthrough, and we can't. That is also very capitalistic, right? Is like everything has to be like a hit or purchased or da-da-da-da. There also needs to be mediocre, mundane Asian plays, you know, or Asian movies.
But here's the thing. I mean, yeah, totally. I mean, here's the thing, though. I mean, I think it's like that rubric for defining success is also like, I mean, how do like there's okay, because here, like, I think I've been thinking about this a lot, and that's why I'm excited in particular that Anne and Christine are here at the same time, because I think there's something connected that I thread through in your work, which is like what I think about I've spent a lot of time in history. Like I've written, like this is just what I've been doing. I've been writing these things about pockets of Asian American history, and this is bleak stuff. This is not fun stuff, right? It's terrible. It's terrible, and it's like defined by failure. It's a really horrible place to spend that much time, and just marking the ways in which like our history in this country is marked by failure, right? And just feeling like, what is the takeaway there? And what is like, how do I find success in that? And it's one of the reasons like why I think like, you know, like Afong Moy, why it was important for me, like even though obviously she's there to sell furniture, that she have a purpose, right? That she have this sense of, I'm here to bring peace to the world. Like that's why I'm here, you know, that it's because the other thing, like Anne, like I remember reading, I think it was in a New York Times editorial, like this notion of the difference between grief and grievance, and the way in this country, how culturally we're very comfortable talking about grievance, but not about grief. And I think that like part of what I'm trying to do is like, I think it's grief, like trying to grieve for like part of conjuring Afong Moy is to want to grieve with her, to want to like, you know, acknowledge to her that I see the ways in which she was wronged, you know, that let her feel that. And the other thing, like just like the reason, like why it's important for me to have often this sense of like world peace is that, like Stephanie, as you know, like grief is actable. It's an action, right? To grieve, there are stages of it. Like there are well-known stages of it. It's a journey to a destination. It's actable, but grievance is not. It's not actable, right? It's not an action. It's passive. And so, what do you do with that, right? And so, like a lot of this is in aid of me being like, what is that? Like that thing that Christine, you mentioned, that sort of like, what did you say? A racial harmony, like a post-racial paradise. Like, I don't even know what that would be, or like, I don't even know how to define what is my Afong vision of the future. And in a way, like I'm still trying to locate that, because I think we, as a cultural community, we don't, like, I mean, I think theater people too, we don't celebrate our successes. We just don't do that, you know? And so just finding those moments where, and just being conscious of the worry of how bogged down we can get into grievance, and how stifling that can be, you know, creatively, but also like just personally, right? And just trying to figure out, like, how do we, you know, how do we find some moments of happiness in the world?
Yeah.
Has some sense of success and something actable to move towards. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also, you know, not necessarily in some of our backgrounds in Asian culture to celebrate success. It's almost like that's like a bad thing. So that's also another aspect of the burden or the culture that we carry. I do want to jump over to a few questions that came from our audience. Jeff Landsman asks, would folks on the panel consider talking about the significant difference in the stereotypical view of Asian women and Asian men, which is very interesting because Atung says, you know, I'm irrelevant, and Afong says, yeah, you're irrelevant. So would anybody on the panel want to talk about the difference in perception for Asian men and women?
Can I say something on behalf of Atung?
Yes, please. Yeah.
And I'll get to the question too, but I just want to say that I thought he was so critical a character. You know, I mean, there's that moment when she says, you know, you're irrelevant, but in fact, Atung as a kind of witness for Afong Moy was so important. I mean, this is like, you can see that I'm a big Beckett fan. So this is like a very Becketting aspect of the play for me, Lloyd, right? Where she's almost like Winnie in Happy Days, right? She's in her soliloquy. And the only person that can really bear witness is not the audience who only see her as a thing, but actually Atung, right? So he's such a critical presence to witness herself, her bearing herself witness to herself, right? Her performance, not only for the audience, but the performance that she's doing for herself. And so I just want to say, I think Atung is a very important character. So I think, you know, the typical view of Asian women is that, you know, they are, you know, it's always ambivalent, right? That she's either the lotus blossom or the dragon lady. You know, she's either the geisha or the innocent, you know, flower. And Asian, you know, and I think a lot of scholars have noted the ways in which Asian men have been effeminized or demasculinized in Western culture. And, you know, the play M Butterfly is all about that, the David Henry Wan play. But one of the things I was thinking about, because I wrote this book that was very specifically, deliberately, only about Asian femininity, and it's partially because I feel like she has been such a figure of erasure, as we're talking about, and also because I feel like even though she is such a encrusted racist, sexist figure, she actually hasn't been theorized that much by feminists, like, or certainly in the academy, you know, like in if you think about feminist theory, there's a lot of feminist theory around the Black women, the white woman, the brown woman, but not the yellow woman. And so I very deliberately wanted to write a book about Asian women and not Asian men. But of course, in writing that book, I thought a lot about Asian masculinity. And one of the things that I thought was, in one sense, they're very different, right? Because Asian women are associated with ornamentality, with aesthetics, with decoration, and et cetera. Whereas Asian men, of course, are not associated with that. But I do think they share one thing, and that is the idea of instrumentality. I think that there is a way in which the Asian body has been seen as instrumental for a very, very long time. And for the Asian female body, she's instrumental in being the kind of food for a kind of aesthetic fantasy, an erotic fantasy, whereas the Asian man has been seen as a instrument of basically, labor, right? The coolie, the coolie who is not only seen as that we're seeing as perfect for labor because they are supposedly insensate to pain, right? They don't suffer pain the way white people do because they're not quite human, and therefore they make the perfect, coolie. So I think that even though on the surface it looks like there are stereotyping very different ways, I think underneath those differences is a logic about instrumentality around the figure of the Asian body that is, I think, still very true to this day. And I think about the ways in which this is why Asian Americans are seen as useful and competent, but very unlikable. And that's actually there was a very famous psychology test that was done not that long ago, about like 5-6 years ago, where this psychologist, Susan Fisk, did a survey, and she basically asked Americans, which is to say white Americans, what they thought about Asians along two particular vectors. And one is, do you find them competent and or intelligent? And the other is, do you find them warm, likable, or cold and unlikable? And you can probably guess the result without me even having to tell you that most people thought Asians were high in competence and intelligence, but very low in warmth, that they're very unlikable, and I find that, so I think that's part of what I mean by how I think the Asian men and women are actually stereotyped similarly along this sort of idea of how useful they are.
So I'm going to jump in here with sort of two ways in, which is to sort of mark that the ways in which Asian women and Asian men have been stereotyped has actually been structured by law. And this is connected to what Anne is saying about the kind of instrumentalizing that happens, because there is something particular when Stephanie was talking about what it means to like get in through the door and then both be like, have the entire weight of your people on you, right? Some of this is like the inverse of this is connected to that instrumentalizing, because Asians, men and women, have been considered as fungible, irreplaceable with each other, unrecognizable and indistinct from each other. And that has been connected with like immigration law in the US, the way in which what has actually sort of allowed or curtailed actual Asian people being in the US. So this idea to like just sort of like put your head down and do work, I mean, this was directly connected to bringing in coolie labor, so that when California enters into the Union in the US, as a non-slaveholding state, as a free state, it's really a labor problem. And so the solution to that labor problem was to bring in Chinese coolies, but to ensure that they do not live here, that they only come to do work and then to leave, to not take root, right? And so these stereotypes about effeminate Asian men, this is as much connected to like, if they're just these laboring bodies that that can like lay down the tracks of the railroad at a cheaper rate than anybody else. At the same time, because they're like a bachelor society, they're all just men living with men, cooking and doing laundry. These are gendered labors, right? Then they dress differently, eat differently, right? So what gets encrusted upon these Asian men are these, stereotypes of effeminacy, right? And so I think that like there's that like even at the same time as there are these like significant differences, I think that both like Anna and I are actually talking about the ways in which like law has shaped them, the things that have shaped them similarly, this kind of fungibility in which they're all sort of replaceable, that one is another butterfly upon a butterfly upon a butterfly. But in the same way, there are always these interesting flip sides, right? So that we can have Dragon Lady and like Lotus Blossom, and then we can have the model minority, but then we can also have Yellow Peril, right? We can have like disease incarnate, right? Whether that is like taking over the world like Fu Manchu or COVID-19, right? And so these are all these flip sides that sort of keep sort of happening. And I just want to sort of throw in one term to like what happens when there's like shitty Asian American plays or movies or things like that. And that's Viet Thanh Nguyen, Asian American scholar and Pulitzer Prize winning novelist of The Sympathizer and The Committed. He has this term called narrative plenitude. So say whenever you see that in a way what he calls for is that there needs to be narrative plenitude. So when you, I feel like, wasn't there like recently a reality television show about like Asian Americans, like Bling something? We can think of that as narrative plenitude, right? And then as like a kind of rejoinder to the kind of depressingness, like it is bleak. Asian American, like the history of Asians in the US is quite bleak, like, right? But there's a way in which that bleakness is like what gets marked by the archive, like who falls in and who falls out. There's also a way in which like all 5 of us here are actually like the very, you know, like the 7 generations things, like the very fact that persistence, like people persisted, right? There's this great moment in Mike Liu's Tiger Style, where at the end of the play, like the very fact that we live and breathe, like our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, like that's sort of a miracle, especially if we look at a history that has been so violent, so like rife with like white supremacy and erasure, right? The very fact of our existence is like almost a miracle.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Please.
Oh, and in terms of narrative plenitude, you know, with all the things that have been happening over this last, you know, year plus some change, I thought I would want to come out of this time being a doctor or just completely abandoning the art ship and be like, I got to do something. I got to really this time do something that's a little bit more practical and useful for the world. But the narrative that and the thought that came to me over and over again throughout the pandemic was how important it is for new stories to exist. Because even just creating more narrative plenitude, you're creating counter narratives for people to latch onto, to understand and reimagine the future. And so there's something really beautiful about journalism and and knowing the facts of where we come from so that we have like a pool of information so that history may not repeat itself. But then we also need the reimaginings so that younger generations and even just us can catch whiff and be reminded of what else is possible, to break free from the little room that we're in, which is our tunnel vision of this time. So, yeah.
Yeah, I love that term. I love that term, narrative plenitude. And it really does take the pressure off because you're still contributing. Even if I direct a play and I'm crappy at it, I'm still contributing. So that's good. That's a good thing. I also want to share a comment from Michael Glass, one of our audience members tonight. He says that Wang Qinfu, later 19th century revolutionary in China, civil rights crusader in the US, journalist, businessman, and he performed. He put himself and Chinese culture on display. I'm not familiar with this person. Is anyone familiar with?
Yes. So the person who has written, I think, most about Wang Qinfu is Jack Chen, or he goes by Zhang Po
I
Chen.
love him. He was my teacher.
Oh, he's brilliant, right? He's brilliant.
He taught me in a class called Chinatown and the American Imagination.
Yeah, I mean, I'm teaching a class next fall called Chinatown USA, which is very much inspired by Jack's work. But so he wrote a book called Chinatown, New York Before Chinatown, and in it there's a biography of this really incredible man that actually very few people know about, but he was quite amazing. But that's the other thing. I mean, there are a lot of there's a lot of history of violence and negativity in Asian American history, but there's also a lot of history of people who have been extraordinary. We don't hear about them either, right? And so one of the things I think, I get very depressed lately, but one of the only thing that makes me feel a little bit more optimistic is that I feel like in all frankness, I think there is nothing I can do to change the mind of someone who's really a racist. I'm not going to convert them. I'm not going to change their mind. But all we need, and you can never get rid of, racism completely, but all we need is enough good people, right? Who would, do the right thing. And so I feel like education is so important. I've been working with local people to to introduce Asian American history as part of American history in elementary school, K through 12, age appropriate, of course, K through 12, and of course in universities. But one of the many reasons why we, don't know. I mean, we sit here and say what has been happening has been shocking, but not surprising. That's because we know this history. And the fact that most people don't, I mean, even a lot of Asian Americans don't know this history. And it's because it's just not taught. Mm-hmm. It needs to be in the schools. It needs to be in the textbooks. And that's something we can actually do. Mm-hmm. That's an action.
Yeah.
That can be done. Yeah.
Yeah. And contribute to the narrative plenitude as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, absolutely.
I think it's also important to remember, specifically with theater, but just all performing arts or all art in general, art is not a Western thing. It's not something that only exists in the West, theater is not American. There has been the Peking opera. There are many old, like 1800, 1700 Chinese poets that so much of Chinese culture is actually founded upon poetry, and so just kind of taking moments to re-empower that we actually also come from a lineage that celebrates the poetics, and like, as cliche as it is, like studying the cherry blossoms and learning a lesson about life, watching the wind blow the blossoms away. That's a really common kind of Asian concept, and so remembering that as creators and participants as well, decentralizing it from just a Western way of storytelling.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We do have only a few minutes left. And Stephanie, I wanted to ask about your research or your work into Afong Moy. I know it was a very short rehearsal process, so I'm not, what stuck out with you? It was something that came up in conversation earlier about performance. What essence came out about Afong Moy for you as you thought about putting her on tonight for us?
Well, Yiwen made a really incredible dramaturgical packet that I thought was really interesting and fascinating. And honestly, just seeing, there was a document that she'd included that was one of the first images that was drawn of Afong Moy. And it had a description of how she was being described. I can't remember it off the top of my head. But how she was physically portrayed, just literally documented in that historical artifact, kind of said enough, I think they talked about her feet and how they were super small because they were bound. But you could tell that even in the writing of it, it was exoticized as opposed to a curiosity of culture. It was more of a alien being. And I think there's something about just seeing a drawing is different than seeing a photograph. And so you're already feeling, even a photograph, I guess, is this way. You still feel the painter's hand behind it. And to me, I think because it was a short process, it was mostly just, it kind of conjured and sparked for me this ghost of Afong and just wanting to learn more about her through Lloyd's work, actually, because I would have never known about her.
Yeah, and I think that spirit is exactly the spirit that we hear her say through Lloyd's words of I'm curious. And so back to what you said, instead of a place of superiority and looking at difference as, oh, I'm better than that, that's so weird. It's more, why did they choose that? Let's really investigate. And that, I think, is also at the heart of how Lloyd wrote Afong. We're just over time. Are there any last thoughts anybody feels really compelled to share?
I just want to give a shout out to Yiwen and to Rammel, who I don't know, but that guy's amazing. Stephanie, why'd you have to be so mean to him?
He was so amazing. Amazing. Yiwen is amazing too.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Timeline audience, for your time. We had a great evening here with you, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you.